Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Cook, and I'm having another episode. I'm prone to them, as you know by now. This is a really great episode, though, because I'm talking to two amazing people who are at the front lines of the battle to protect our planet from climate change, disastrous climate change, largely caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And both of them are at the center of some really innovative efforts that are different than almost anything else that's going on to try and deal with this and hold oil companies accountable. My first guest is Melissa Missy Sims. She is senior counsel at the law firm Milberg, Coleman, Bryson, Phillips, Grossman. She is representing 52 Puerto Rican municipalities in a groundbreaking class action lawsuit that's aimed at holding fossil fuel companies responsible for damage that's caused by extreme weather. And she's also worked on a variety of other cases. We'll get into that in just a minute. Richard Wiles is president of the Center for Climate Integrity, where he guides the organization's efforts to hold big oil companies accountable for climate damages through litigation, just like Missy. Now, previously, Richard was senior vice president and vice president for strategic communications at Climate Central, a senior staff officer at the National Research Council at the National Academy of Sciences. And in full disclosure, he is the co-founder of Environmental Working Group of EWG and former executive director of EWG. And one more disclosure, I'm on the board of the Center for Climate Integrity, I'm very proud to say. So thank you for joining today. Thank you even more for your amazing work. We're going to dive right into it. Missy, one of the things that you two have in common is a creative approach to your work. Richard's kind of invented Environmental Working Group's MO across much of our work. And you've brought a real creativity to your litigation, starting with a story that featured you. It's called She's on a Mission from God, Suing Big Oil for Climate Damages, referencing your work in Puerto Rico. But before that, you took on some pretty big adversaries in smaller cases. Can you say a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So I'm from North Central Illinois. I'm here now. I live outside of Princeton, Illinois. I'm from a little tiny town called Tiskwa, Tiskilwa. And I practiced locally since 1995. So I did everything: divorces, wills, trusts, general practice of law, criminal defense work at times. But my boss, Bill Wimbiscus, was the preeminent municipal attorney outside of Chicago. And so he kind of taught me everything I knew about municipal law. So I was the city attorney for a bunch of little tiny towns, and I went to all their board meetings and went to their zoning board of appeal meetings, and I'm Catholic, and I like to say I spent my purgatory here on earth going to all those meetings at night. So as part of my duties as a municipal prosecutor, I would prosecute ordinance violations. And what I found was that these people were just trying to feed their families. Nobody was really trying to hurt anyone, but rules are rules, and municipalities have rules in place, such as no littering. And in certain towns, you can only have 2 or 3 dogs in town, and can't have farm animals. You could only have domesticated animals. So, I became the face of those prosecutions, but also coupled with me being Catholic and wanting to help underprivileged people, it was kind of a problem with me going to court every Tuesday and Friday and prosecuting these people for what you would consider as mundane charges. So as a city attorney, I would do that. And I learned, probably about 15 years of doing this, the scope and the power that a municipality has. You've heard the term, you can't fight City Hall. I mean, that came from reality, because it's really difficult to get found not guilty of an ordinance violation when a municipality can almost declare anything a public nuisance. Even a blue house in some jurisdictions are a public nuisance. If you've ever been to Santa Fe, you can only have certain colors of your house, right? So municipalities have this almost unfettered ability to declare anything a public nuisance. And so, 15 years of that, I saw that power can be really oppressive to people who are targeted. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't unequally applying that law. So the village of Depew was one of our clients, and it was also the 14th worst environmental disaster in the country. So Exxon, CBS, and Viacom made film for the film industry. When everything went digital in the 80s, they left town and left bright blue mud puddles in town. No one had cleaned it up. For 60 years, they were studying on what to do with these bright blue mud puddles. Meanwhile, the village of Depew had the highest MS rate in the country. All the white people left, right? Not all of them, but quite a few white people left. And you have plummeting property values. And so one of the excuses that they used was that the value of the property was less than the cost to clean it up. And so therefore that was a factor in how much they cleaned it up. And I said, no, that's racism. That's environmental racism. You should not even consider the value of the property. You should just clean it up. So it really, affected me. And I was at a board meeting in August of 2006, and this is what the New York Times did an article on. I was listening to the defendants, Exxon, CBS, and Viacom, and the EPA all point fingers at each other and say why they can't do anything about it. And I leaned over to the mayor, and he said, Missy, what can we do? And I said, we're going to sue him. And he said, can we? I said, I don't know. So I went home that night to my house, and I took a run. And that's where I get alone with the Holy Spirit. And I said, help me help these people. And he said, find them. And I thought, I find people every day, right? For dog poop in their yard, tall weeds, broken windows, And I thought, okay. So I call a friend of mine who does environmental work for the big companies. And I said, if I do this, will I look stupid? She said, nobody's ever tried it before. Why not? And I thought, okay, well, as long as I don't look stupid, So me and my 95-year-old boss fined Exxon, CBS, and Viacom for ordinance violations in traffic court. And we got dismissed out in traffic court for something they did 60 years ago, because in Illinois, at least, and most states,
oh my God,
there's a doctrine called nullum tempus occurret regit. And it means no time runs against the king. So municipalities, the statute of limitations is removed from municipalities so long as they're pursuing a public right. And the theory is that the town should not be penalized because a previous administration had slept on their rights. We get dismissed out, we go to the Seventh Circuit, and for the first time, they rule that there is no preemption between federal and local law. That was the real issue, is federal law, does it preempt local law? Now, if you know anything about preemption, the way it works is federal preempts state and state preempts local. But in the state statute, there was nothing that prevented us from fining. And the Seventh Circuit said that the abatement portion of what I was asking for, in other words, to clean it up immediately, that was beyond the authority of the municipality. But there was nothing that said that we could not fine. And so that was the impetus for getting me involved in the litigation that I'm doing now.
So I believe those were littering tickets, weren't they?
Yeah, they were littering. Yes.
Littering tickets. You just got to love that, right?
Well, it's the easiest thing to prove.
Right.
All I have to prove is that your property ended up on somebody else's property. That's all I have to prove. I don't have to prove nuisance. I don't have to prove that it was going to be injurious to people. All I have to prove is it's yours on somebody else's property. So as the prosecutor, I always wanted to go for the easiest case to prove. And that's the easiest case to prove is littering.
Missy, I just wanted to ask you, and you spoke so candidly about it in that great story in the New York Times, and that'll be a link in our show notes. Your faith and the importance of your faith in what you do. You already mentioned your concern for disadvantaged people who maybe didn't have enough money. You're sort of litigating a little bit with your heart here as well as your mind. Can you speak a little bit more about the spiritual strain in motivating you?
If you know what is right and you don't do it, it's a sin. It's just a sin. If God has given you the ability and He has opened your eyes into something and you don't pursue it, you're not using the gifts that He gave you. And these are gifts that He gave me. He gave me the ability, I think, to see beyond. Everything I do, I look to who made money and who was disadvantaged by it. Mm-hmm. Really, when you look at Jesus and His ministry, it was going after the marginalized and people that the society throws away. right? And that's what we're doing now is we're disproportionately affecting communities of color with pollution, whether it's carbon pollution. I mean, what, a third of all Superfund sites are on or near Native American lands? And I think when we are having our creature comforts at the cost of these disadvantaged people, we have to look for solutions because God, his attributes are mercy and justice. And so we have to seek justice for him. And that's just the way I was raised. When we went to bed every night, my mom would say to us, "What did you do to help other people today?" That's at the core belief, I believe, of Catholics especially, is because we look for ways in the community to help each other out. So everything that I do is guided by that principle.
It's a beautiful principle. I was raised in the Midwest, Catholic as well. I've kind of fallen a little away from the faith. But if more Catholic trial lawyers start suing oil companies, I'm coming back to the flock. I'm telling you, Missy. Praise the Lord and pass the deposition.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you a little bit, and then I want to jump to Richard and get the background on some of these cases. So you were in Puerto Rico. How did you happen to be in Puerto Rico? And then to go after these oil companies for damage in Puerto Rico under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. I should be watching a Sopranos episode when I say those words, but I'm not. I'm talking to a trial lawyer who is going after oil companies.
So I'm at Millburg now, and Millburg has an office in Puerto Rico. And so I was there in Puerto Rico right after Maria. Given my municipal experience, I weighed in on the opioid crisis, and I represented municipalities all over the country and in Puerto Rico regarding that. And so at that point in time, there was lawsuits on file, none that had gone after a single event, and certainly none that have gone after hurricane damage. And so the science was just not there. But of course, there was a hunch that I wanted to follow up on. And eventually the science caught up with our hunch. And it wasn't until recently that they came up with the intensification of hurricanes. But at the time that Maria happened, there was no scientific evidence that linked climate change and intensity of hurricanes.
Okay. And Richard, you've been following the science for a long time, right on top of it. And when you started the Center for Climate Integrity, the idea was that the science had matured to the point and there was an opportunity to hold these oil companies accountable that hadn't been exploited much before. And that's where the center comes in, trying to help states and municipalities and other jurisdictions, help them realize that they might be able to go after these oil companies for the damage that we're seeing unfold right now caused by climate change. Say a little bit about the whole approach you've been taking.
Yeah, well, Missy's case is unusual. I just want to go back to that and give her a little more credit. It's the first racketeering case. It's the first case that was based on a single event, right? And it was a deadly event, killed over 4,000 people. So it was a really pioneering case. And there have been one additional state-level racketeering case filed since then. But it was really important because it diversified the playing field, meaning that it brought in a new theory. And it was the first case, based on a single event. There have been one more case somewhat based on the Pacific Northwest heat dome of 2021. But Missy's case still is the only one that's really based on a single deadly event. So it's important for any number of reasons. And it's really unique.
And can I just ask a clarifying question? Is it federal RICO? Because I know some states, I don't know about Puerto Rico, they have RICO statutes too. Is this a federal RICO?
Yes.
Yeah. Missy's case is a federal RICO case. There's one state RICO case. There's reasons for that, given Puerto Rico's status, et cetera.
Yeah.
But the genesis of the case is there was one scientific breakthrough, if you will. I might be overstating it a bit, but it was a really important piece of work that finally attributed fossil fuel emissions from the oil majors to overall emissions that are causing climate change. So for the first time ever, Richard Heady published a paper, I think it was in 2014 or so, that basically was, for the first time, assigned sort of a percentage of total carbon emissions to all the biggest emitters, Exxon, Chevron, Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, etc. That was a really important step because for the first time, we could confidently say that the oil majors were responsible for a significant portion of the greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. So that's bedrock science. And then the other important component of the cases is the documents that came out beginning, honestly, if we go all the way back to our friend Kurt Davies in
Yeah.
the late 90s, getting documents way, way, way back in the day, showing that the industry knew. And now it looks like is back as far as the 50s. But in the 1990s, I think the documents were showing that Exxon in particular had state-of-the-art climate science program in the 70s, and they predicted catastrophic outcomes. They use those words, right? They were writing it down internally, basically going, oh my God, look at this. This will be catastrophic for a significant portion of the global population, et cetera, et cetera. So they knew, right? So that was those documents are at the core of Missy's case and all the other cases. But then it's not enough to know. You also have to lie, okay? Those are the two components you need. You say a tobacco case, an opioid case. You know your product's going to cause damage. Okay, that's bad, but it's not necessarily bad if you come forward with that. But if you lie about it and run a racketeering enterprise, let's say, to cover it up, or if you just cover it up without the racketeering, well, either way, if you're lying and running an active disinformation campaign, those two components give grounds for litigation, just like tobacco. So the evidence was there and the science was there around 2016. And we were formed then, 2017, to basically take that science and take those documents and begin to educate public officials in municipalities and state attorneys general about the possibilities to recover the costs of all the damage and to take these guys to court, basically to apply the tobacco or opioid theory to those cases. And now I think there's around 30 municipal cases in the US outside of Puerto Rico, and 9 attorneys general have filed. One more has announced intent to file. So that'll be 10 attorneys general and 30 municipalities in the US plus Puerto Rico. So it's a growing wave of litigation against these companies who knew they were going to cause this damage, knew they were going to kill people, knew they were going to destroy property, knew they were going to do everything that's happening today, and didn't give a damn about it and covered it up. Really critical to the cases is proving that they're still lying, right? There's a really important component. What they do now, instead of denying the science and lying about the fact that their products cause climate change, they lie about their commitment to solving the problem, right?
Yeah.
We're going to do CCS. We're going to build 60,000 miles of pipelines, apparently, to move carbon around or whatever. We're going to, we're going to have algae-based fuels, right? We're going to do all this stuff, which, of course, they're not going to do. It's more lying. So now they lie about solutions. They used to lie about the problem.
Yeah. Missy, what are the requirements under RICO for a case like yours to go forward? There has to be a conspiracy. There have to be conspirators. What are the elements? And had you tried RICO cases before?
Yeah, we filed for racketeering. We have not tried any of them. Most of the defendants end up settling before trial, which I think when you get at their documents, they want to settle. So what racketeering is, a conspiracy of people outside of themselves. Okay, so more than just one person and more than just one organization who work with someone else to facilitate a fraud or one of the other 19 predicate offenses that are in the racketeering statute. We chose mail and wire fraud, and that's what's normally filed. When we filed this, people acted like it was such an anomaly, but they're filed all the time. And in fact, right now, they're the cases du jour to file. These defendants, the oil defendants, they're using racketeering against protesters, right? So racketeering right now is just everybody's filing it. We filed it in the emission cheat cases with Volvo and Ford, and it was filed in the opioid litigation. It was filed in a case here in Illinois where I'm sitting against the Illinois Supreme Court Chief Justice and State Farm for racketeering for the faulty parts litigation. It resulted in like a $6 billion settlement. So racketeering cases are more common than you think. It's just that no one had filed it within this context. But it fits within the context because all we have to prove is that more than one organization conspired with another to facilitate an enterprise. So it's the enterprise that you're suing, okay? And that's what's so perfect about this litigation is because we can show that these defendants all glommed on together in this enterprise. Now, it's not just Exxon's 1.2% of global emissions. Now it's 40% of their total global emissions. Then we can show that that's a substantial contributing factor to the intensification of the hurricanes. So it may be harder to prove to a jury that Exxon alone, 1%, caused an increase in the intensity of hurricanes. But if we show that there is 40%, then it's a much easier task for the plaintiffs here.
And it's the documents that tie this together?
Yeah, it's fascinating. In other cases, we have to prove racketeering by like a tacit agreement. So as a wink, wink, nod, nod, hey, we'll work together, So in the opioid litigation, you saw that the manufacturers and the distributors of opioids, they didn't have a battle plan. They didn't have what we have here. We have a victory memo that they created in the March of 1998. In opioids, there was no memo. There was no email amongst them saying, hey, let's lie about this and let's hoodwink the world into believing that this will cure their pain, So there was no agreement in the other cases. We usually just have to prove that there was a tacit arrangement. But here we have an actual agreement. In March of 1998, Richard probably knows it by heart, but it's called the Victory Memo. And that the API and the oil industry and the coal industry all worked together with marketers and promoters to dupe the world into believing that their products did not and would not cause an effect on the climate. And they actually delineated certain responsibilities under this on who would be promoters and who would be allocators, who would get the money, how it would get done. That is unheard of in racketeering litigation. Even in the tobacco litigation, they did not have this kind of written battle plan. But here in the climate change litigation, they actually used the tobacco strategists for this program. There was no racketeering complaint at that point in time. They probably wouldn't have put it in writing. But in March of 1998, they actually used the tobacco strategists. In fact, some of the same scientists overlapped between the tobacco and the climate change racketeering event.
Uh-huh. If possible, we might need to put this victory memo in the show notes. And so this is a federal case, so there's not a worry about preemption there, right? You're straight to the source?
Well, so we did file state Commonwealth counts. So depending on what happens with the Supreme Court, if they take the other state filed cases and rule in those matters, it may whittle down our case. But we have the backup of the federal racketeering, but also don't forget we filed for antitrust. We filed for monopoly and antitrust, and that they tried to thwart clean energy alternatives. And we're the only case that has done that. I don't even believe any of the attorney generals in other states have filed that. But Milberg has a long history of doing antitrust litigation. So we went ahead and added those counts.
For those who may not know off the top of their head, the API is a reference to the American Petroleum Institute. Was that sort of the hub of this activity?
We'll find out.
It looks like they definitely were one of several hubs. Let's put it that way.
But you have to understand, though, is that API, even if it's a hub, it's made up of the same people. So all of the other organizations were members, were on the board, were on the executive committee. So it's not like it's some alternate being that you can throw under the bus.
Right.
And they shared in earnest for decades what they were finding out about the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect was coined in the 1800s. It's not new science, right? And so they were studying when the Industrial Revolution came up, hey, what's the effect of this on the planet? And then, these defendants were studying it for decades and trading information amongst themselves and to each other through the API. And they did so, interestingly enough, to fortify their own oceanic equipment against rising sea levels.
Right. They were worried about the offshore drilling and so forth, and the coastal facilities, which, of course, are everywhere in the oil industry, right?
Right. But at the same time, didn't afford us that knowledge.
Yeah. We're taking care of ourselves. And if your city floods, oops.
Yeah.
So the API was kind of maybe one of the clubhouses where they met, so to speak, and hatched these plans. And now, at least for the state cases, I wanted to touch on that because there's been a story just this week about the Supreme Court, I don't know, flirting? Is that the right legal term? Trying to figure out if it's going to rule on some of the requests from the oil industry to move out of state court, which was where most of these cases have been brought, I guess, with the example of your RICO case, Missy. They want to go to federal court where they seem to feel they'll have a big advantage. And the Supreme Court recently has sort of said, hey, let's find out what the Justice Department thinks about this. Talk to us a little bit, either of you, about what's at play here. They've tried and not succeeded so far to move these cases, as I understand it, to federal court. It's still being tried at the state level. What's going on now? Is this a Hail Mary pass, so to speak?
So I'll let you answer the Hail Mary, Missy, but just for perspective, the industry is really scared of these cases, okay? They're not afraid of the IRA. They're not afraid of the Congress. They own the Republican Party. But these cases, this is a forum that they don't want to be in, and it's a whole body of evidence that they do not want to have to deal with. So the play is to get it in federal court where, setting aside Missy's cases, where there's basically no common law, then the cases go away. It's a simplified version. But if they get to federal court, big chunks of these cases will not do well, probably. But so they tried for 6 years to get them into federal court. And I believe it is 40 federal judges at the district and circuit court level all ruled that no, they belong in state court, including, I think, 7 Trump-appointed judges. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and they asked for all these opinions, and they sent it back to state court as well. So they've lost that battle, right? And there are some cases moving forward. The Massachusetts Attorney General has a consumer fraud case just against Exxon, right? It's a very narrowly focused case, consumer and investor fraud. Just basically says you can't lie to our consumers, and you definitely did. That case is going to trial, period. It's not going to be stopped. It'll probably go to trial, and I'm going to say the way Exxon pushes stuff back, 2026 maybe, but then you'll get a verdict. And if there's a finding of liability against Exxon that they did in fact commit fraud, right, about their products and lied about climate change impacts and all that, that is going to be a shockwave through this industry. It's going to help all of these cases. But so there's that. For the rest of the cases, the industry has yet again come up with some crackpot maneuver, and I'll turn this over to Missy in a second, but where they are appealing what's called an interlocutory appeal, which for normal humans means like, holy shit, let's just think of something and just do it. We'll make something up on a motion to dismiss. So they lost the motion to dismiss the Honolulu case. The Hawaii Supreme Court said, you lost. It's going to trial. Let's get this thing to go. This isn't even debatable. This is not about the Clean Air Act. This is not about emissions. This is about lying, okay, about your product. It's not about emissions. Okay, let's go. So based on that decision, they came up with some sort of an attempt to appeal that to the Supreme Court. And this time, not on whether it should be in federal or state court, but this is basically on the merits. They're basically saying all these cases that want damages to be paid are preempted by the Clean Air Act. I think that's basically right, Missy? And surprisingly, the Supreme Court did not take it. This is called a cert petition. They did not take it. They asked for the Justice Department's opinion, actually for the United States of America's opinion to be more accurate. And it's interesting. I'm going to get in the weeds here for a second, but Alito, who we all know and love, has been recusing himself from these cases because he owns Exxon and ConocoPhillips stock. So that means you have 4 justices, right? It only takes 4 to accept this cert petition. I think the feeling on our side is if they accept this cert petition, that's not a good sign, because that would mean they just want to get rid of the cases. But they didn't do that. They asked for the DOJ's opinion, the United States opinion. So we'll see what happens. But the interesting thing is, if they do take the case, if they do take this appeal to consider throwing on all these cases, there'll only be 8 justices if Alito continues recusing, which he's done all the way through. And that would mean they'd have to get 5 votes. They'd have to win 5-3 to knock all these cases out, which you kind of think if they had a 5-3 vote, they might have just taken it. On the other hand, who knows? You can never know. You just never know. So we're sort of in this limbo. But meanwhile, state cases are moving forward as this happens. So that was the non-lawyer explanation. So now we can have Missy.
Well, I mean,
fix it up. Whatever I screwed up.
No, interlocutories are just really rare for a court to take, especially a court several levels up, right? So you're talking, I've defended some interlocutories against some of these same defendants in other cases. In fact, I had one where they tried to ask the Seventh Circuit, what is the meaning of an ordinance violation? And they were like, we're not even getting into this, right? So when the interlocutory was denied, they settled the case. So I think that, they can't do another removal because all the removal cases are getting denied and the cases are being remanded. And I think the heat dome case was just remanded back too. So they're all getting remanded. They're all getting remanded, and the Supreme Court has been hands off.
So back to the state court.
Right.
Yeah. And the Supreme Court's been hands off. Now, it could just be a matter of course that they asked DOJ what they think. Because I know when I have an issue about what is the definition of a statute or something like that, they do turn to the attorney generals and say, hey, do you have an opinion on this? So it might just be perfunctory. I think we might be reading in too much that they asked for their position on that. But it is really rare that a higher court would interfere in the middle of a case. And given their me, just like if I was a betting person, just given their past hands-off approach on these cases and what they ruled in the children's trust case, I would say that they're not going to take the interlocutory appeal unless DOJ comes in and says, yeah, we really have a problem here.
Right. What do we think about the DOJ? Leaving aside the technicality, I guess they would be saying, yeah, it's a fair question whether all these cases should be thrown out. What is DOJ, or have they taken a position on these cases? Where's the Biden administration? Have they been confronted with a decision to say where they come in on these cases?
Well, during the 2020 campaign, the president pledged to strategically support the cases, and that became part of his platform and part of his climate agenda, strategic support for the cases. They did that, I think, in the remand. When they were asked for their opinion by the Supreme Court, they said the cases should be remanded back to state court. This one, there's a number of options. I don't like to bet on these things, but it feels like they would. It just feels like the law is so clear here that there's no grounds for this interlocutory appeal.
Yeah, let a jury decide.
Yeah, I think that's where the DOJ will come down.
And when it comes to a jury, my experience, and Richard and I did a lot of work with documents like this back in the day on asbestos, on MTBE, PCBs, and other toxic chemicals. And two things that pop out is that these documents really have an impact, it seems to me, on the public, on politicians, I would guess on juries, when they see what the companies knew and when they knew it. And it's so damning. And we've seen this again and again. PFAS chemicals. I had Rob Ballat on the show not too long ago, and he's the trial lawyer, also featured in the New York Times Magazine, who took DuPont to task and held DuPont accountable. And a big part of the strength of his case were the documents that Richard and I used to read as soon as they'd end up in the EPA docket. I'd get a note from Rob saying, check the docket. But the documents were so damning. These were vital. And I can imagine the oil companies don't want in Hawaii or anywhere else to go in front of a jury and have someone stand up with documents on a screen describing what they knew in the 70s and 80s and 90s and lied about. Is that kind of your experience, Missy, as you've litigated this matter and others and prepared your case?
Everybody's waiting on the documents. We have the documents. They're here. Shell had a memo that was just discovered a couple years ago called the Tina memo, right? Do you know about Tina?
No.
She's the name of my Tesla. I named my Tesla Tina. So Tina means there is no alternative. So Shell had an internal, and it was widely distributed among their shareholders, memo called Tina. And it was coined after Margaret Thatcher, who came up with this. I don't think she came up with it, but she used it. And people attribute it to her. But it means there is no alternative. And it's an investment type analysis saying, okay, we're at this point right now. There's no going back, guys. Right. So in, I think, November of 98, they talked about where Shell was going. And they say in there that, hey, Fossil fuels aren't going anywhere. There's this thing called Amazon and the internet. They literally predicted how we're going to be buying off Amazon. So read Tina. Tina is like a glimpse into the future, into what we're...
Another link.
Oh, absolutely. Put Tina in.
We'll put it in the show notes.
So in Tina, they talk about how there will be a series of violent storms across the east coast of the United States that will cause such devastation that it will spark a class action lawsuit against the fossil fuel industry for just not disclosing what they knew was true. So the documents are there. My point is that I'm not waiting on smoking gun documents. If you read our complaint, which is 200 and some pages long and probably over 6,000 pages worth of documents, we have the documents. What we don't have is the dark money funding trail. And that's what we're going to get in discovery.
Okay.
That's the smoking gun, is who funded what and when. And that's the racketeering. That's how we're going to prove racketeering, and that's how we're going to prove antitrust.
If I close my eyes, I think I'm maybe listening to a pitch from a screenwriter, but it's real. It's the real deal. And that goes to the question of what does the need to resort to litigation of this sort say about our regulatory framework and how our laws and regulations are being implemented? My observation over the years, and I think Richard and I sort of formulated this together when we were at EWG, is it is really hard to find an example of a high-profile toxic chemical catastrophe where the public reacted and finally the government reacted that didn't have very close to its start litigation by the trial bar that brought evidence to light that the government should have had decades before it had it, and only had it in the case of PFAS and MTB and other toxic chemical contamination issues. That information only came to the government because it was first pried out of these companies in civil litigation. My view is that this is one of the most important, if not the most important, remedy at hand at a time when we see too many of our regulatory agencies and the political process captured by the regulated industries they're intended to watchdog. The immune system of the regulated industry has kicked in so effectively. Campaign contributions, phony science, front groups, all the rest, that it has really paralyzed what we might call regular order. You pass an environmental law, you have regulations, and they apply and hold these companies accountable. But now we have to do it, it seems to me, in the courts.
Yeah, I mean, just look at history. There hasn't been any major social issue or toxic disaster. You can look at asbestos, you can look at lead, you can look at civil rights, marriage equality, you can look at PFAS, any of them. None of them were resolved without a robust litigation strategy as part of the operation. What we think is accountability first, then we're going to get the climate policies we need. But we can't get there until we hold this industry accountable so that people understand what problem they're trying to fix, right? You have to know what problem you're trying to fix if you're going to have policies to fix it. And the litigation will show you that. I mean, opioids, I just read the book Dope Sick, which just made me sick.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable that it took trial lawyers, essentially, again, to fix that, right? Like, how many people needed to die there before we step in and do something about it, right? And the trial lawyers essentially came to the rescue. So we think that litigation is a core component of any social change movement or any malevolent actor at this scale. And the problem in the climate community has been that only until very recently has this litigation directed against the oil companies to hold them accountable been part of the landscape. And I think that's partly why we haven't gotten very far.
Yeah.
But Missy, go ahead.
It's still the greatest country in the world. And that's why it's great, is because we have these checks and balances, and we're part of the checks and balances now. Look at the tobacco litigation. So the tobacco companies pled guilty to racketeering. Well, I think they were found guilty of the 120-page judgment against them, but they only appealed the abatement portion of that order that required that they do the ads that you see on TV now, right? Why? Yeah. Because they were going to have to do these ads to show how harmful their products were. And they knew when they did that, their revenue streams would go down. So what did they do in the meantime? They made e-cigarettes and they marketed to children to shore up those losses.
Yeah. Flavored e-cigarettes.
Yeah. And now you've got the government trying to ban, permanently e-cigarettes, but that was intentionally done while they were appealing, while these companies were appealing. That was intentionally done during this time because they knew when we see these ads on TV, you're going to say to your mom, stop smoking, grandma, stop smoking. And people are going to stop smoking. And that's what happened. They were very effective, but they had a strategy, a more long-term strategy to shore up those losses. So they're working on those long-term strategies to shore up losses when we lawyers are successful in the climate change space. So, we have a great legal system here, which other countries want to be a part of, I'm glad it works.
That's an important part. Richard and I, over time, have been involved in a number of efforts to prevent, at the federal level, extinguishing entire categories of state cases around MTB and around asbestos in particular. We fought against that happening so that the legal system could continue to work as it does now. It has flaws, but as you say, Missy, most countries would be very happy to have our system flaws and all. Two more quick questions. It's the human moral dilemma for people in these companies. Richard, I would sometimes read a document that, talked about some horrible thing. The fact that it's covered up and the top of the document would say something like confidential, read and destroy. Who writes documents like that, Missy? What's the moral universe that makes that okay for people to feel like they can do that?
Well, I think in this corporate structure is that they're so big, right? And each person is only doing their one little job in their one little cubicle. So they don't see how it's going to manifest. They're tasked with one thing and they come up with their report and that's it, So had they known maybe that it was going to be used to hurt people, it'd been a different story. So I don't think the workers are given the entire background. They're tasked with a specific job. For instance,
I think that's
Steve
right.
Steve Kinsley, the intern, you know who the intern is, Steve Kinsley at Exxon in 1978?
Yes.
Yeah. So he was tasked with one little report to say, hey, give us your rundown on this carbon issue, right? And so the kid, and he's a grown man now, but he was a kid at the time, and he synthesized information within Exxon and came up with really the carbon budget that is being proposed by the IPCC. So an intern in 1978 came up with the carbon budget and Exxon turned it away. So he did his job. He tried. So I think that there are people in earnest that work there. I don't think they have, malintent. I think they're just tasked with a certain job and it's up to, the powers that be who will answer for it as to what they're going to do. I think the board member, when they were posed with this problem in 1980, I forget who it was, and Richard, but they said, well, what are we going to do about this? And he said, it's not like we're making yogurt. So they're the ones who made those decisions, not the workers.
Right. Not at the working level, but there are people at the middle and higher levels up. What about them?
Well, right now, I think it's a different climate. Every state has whistleblower laws and whistleblower protection. So maybe 20, 30 years ago, they didn't have whistleblower protection and they needed to make their mortgage and they basically put blinders on to only look at what they're dealing with right now. And they're going to justify it, however. But I think now it's a different story. Now you're not going to have the cover up from below to higher. You're just not going to have it because of those whistleblower protections and emails. I mean, you can't, how do you cover it up? Because everything in corporate world is done with 9,000 emails CC'd to 9,000 people. So you can't cover that up.
Richard, what do you think about all this?
I think it's clear I'm not as nice a person as Missy. We can establish that right here. No, I mean, the people at the top of the company know what they're doing. And they don't give a shit, right? They don't care how many people they kill. And they know it. By now, are you kidding me? How do you not know now? And the documents that are coming out from subpoenas by the House Oversight Committee show there's one that came out from Exxon. This is 2018, 2019, where they basically say, yeah, we let's keep saying we support the Paris Agreement, but we're never going to get there So just so everybody knows, this shouldn't have any impact on our drilling or exploration, plans. So keep saying it, but don't worry about it. We're never going to make 1.5, never going to make 2. Like, who are these people? What the hell?
Yeah.
From that level up. I mean, the worst example is Lee Raymond, who was the CEO that really was the hardcore denier at Exxon, who knew everything. He knew all the stuff that the literally world-class Exxon climate team knew in the 70s and 80s. They were the best in the world, right? They were as good as anybody in the government. Their models, they predicted, literally in the 1970s, they predicted the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere within 1/10 of a part per million in 2000. Like, they predicted 370, it was 369.54, right? Yeah. They predicted we'd be at around 420 parts per million. Now we are. They predicted the temperature increase within 1.1 C. These guys were the best, right? And Lee Raymond gets up there and denies it all. Plants uncertainty. He knows what he's doing. Hands that off to Tillerson, does the same thing. Hands it off to Darren Woods, does the same thing. They know what they're doing. They know that the climate's going to be just destroyed. They know that millions of people will die. They know that jillions of dollars of property will be destroyed. They know that people's lives will be upset. They know that it'll cause political turmoil. Look at all the migration that's happening all around the world. That's causing all sorts of political turmoil. They know it all, and they do not care at all. Or if they do care, I don't know how the hell they're expressing this caring. They're expressing it, I think what they'll say is, what about the poor people in Africa who need lights? Exxon suddenly becomes save the children when you bring this up. But, 20 years ago, you might have been able to say, or 25 years ago, there's still some uncertainty in the science, maybe maybe not really, when your own scientists are telling you that, but you could have kind of sort of maybe
more wiggle room
now,
but not now.
Now, are you kidding me? No. So at some point, all these cases we're talking about are civil cases. At some point, I think maybe before I'm dead, there'll be criminal cases brought against some of these people because they know what they're doing and they know the damage it'll cause and the harm it'll cause, and they know it and they don't care. And they're lying to you about it. They're lying to you about their commitments to solutions. And I know Missy says we have all the documents we need. We have a lot of documents, but you can never have too many documents. And we're getting more. And, they're just as damning as the original ones.
Yeah. Let's say all these cases prevail. The white hats win and the oil companies are held accountable. What unfolds from that? They pay a lot of money to the harmed jurisdictions, and then what?
This is a great question because Exxon and company, the oil industry, one of the key arguments they keep making about why these cases should be thrown out is that you're trying to legislate climate policy through the courts, which the cases are absolutely not trying to do. If they would just read one of the pleadings, they would know that this is about lying and the damage that resulted from lying. So the cases are at some level, fundamentally disconnected from any policy consideration at all, right? And that's just what it is. The way to think about it is, what's the level of damages that the companies actually would face? Is it 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion? If they have to pay their fair share of the damages that they've caused, and why wouldn't they have to pay it to every community, right? Why would they just have to pay it to some, right? That is a devastating amount of money, and they know it. But I think probably the most damaging part of these cases for the industry, the toughest thing to recover from is going to be the reputational damage that comes from the documents that are going to come out. As the cases move to trial, the narrative will be told. And all of the evidence of the fact that the companies knew and lied will come out. And it'll come out big time, and it'll come out over and over and over again. And probably, we hope, fundamentally changes the narrative and the way people think about climate change. Now, where that takes us, who knows? But if people suddenly understand that climate change isn't something that you caused because you drove to the store or turned on the heat in the winter, it's about oil companies who lied, right? That's a different thing. And just one last thing. These won't be the last cases. There's lots of other ways to sue these guys. Missy mentioned antitrust. That is a wide open area that I think is going to be emerging. Many more racketeering cases. There could be racketeering cases in 20 different states. Why not wrongful death? And what about plastics, which is a whole other revenue stream for these guys where they're vulnerable? So there's many more ways to hold these guys accountable. And I think that every single one of them should be engaged if we want to have the kind of future that we all want to live in.
Yeah. Where you don't reward knowingly hurting people at a massive scale
Right.
and expecting to get off scot-free.
Yeah.
Or with a slap on the wrist. I couldn't agree more. Right. Well, Richard Wiles, Missy Sims, thank you so much for causing me to have yet another episode. This was a particularly actually encouraging one because it feels like for many of our issues, we don't get to effectively join in the fight against the opposition. They have so many advantages. This is one where it feels like creativity and courage and a moral compass, which, Richard, you have an unerring one, and I've come to learn that Missy does too. This is something to be hopeful about. So thank you very much for joining today, and look forward to following up and keeping up with how these cases unfold.
Well, thanks a lot, Ken. Really appreciate it. And just one thing, we're going to win. We're totally going to win. Just a matter of when.
Here's to winning. Thank you, Missy Sims and Richard Wiles, for coming on the show. And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links for a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if you like this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode. They just don't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by the amazing Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by my friend Moby. Thanks again for listening.